So we got to make sure the data is accessible and correct. Business process automation, right? The foundation, which gets a lot easier in 2013, but especially with 2010, see the rise of companies like Nintex, K2 getting in here, Bamboo, some of sort of the mid-range workflows, but who knows what's going to happen in 2013 with now that SharePoint Designer is so much easier to use and the like. But regardless, this is all coming on SharePoint. This is really why the platform is here for organizations. So the challenges that you guys face, that we see our customers facing, is that we want to try to deliver a very rich experience to our users in a fast and efficient way, right? We kind of don't want it to look like SharePoint. We want the navigation to be intuitive, we want the application to be intuitive, so that we can reuse the training and familiarity across applications for our users, right? So it's not like I'm jumping into my help desk system and it's completely different, then I jump over into my AP system, it's completely different, right? Common platform. We want to provide those applications without the typical stovepiping issues of data and code, right? We want the data all reside in lists and libraries or something attached to those, so that if we want to do some sort of planning or forecasting or what-if scenarios, we can get to that data and present it through SharePoint reporting services, right? Even though that may not be part of what you're doing with an application. And you want to avoid solving problems that have already been solved, right? That's sort of the best thing with developers and the concept of reusable components is let's take things that have already been done, put them together in a new way, and present a solution pretty quickly on SharePoint. And now we want to do it on SharePoint. We don't want to just surface our applications through SharePoint. We want to use all of our UI, all of the security, all of the security trimming, all of the data management, user management, all that stuff. We want to take advantage of that because then we can build smaller applications to deliver some pretty rich functionality. So the concept in developing applications on SharePoint is not to think of them as traditional .NET applications, right? Build on your SharePoint-based services first, then try to use third-party components to provide features and functionality that you want to provide in your application, and then tie it together with custom code if necessary, right? So it's almost in an order of priority. Like in a .NET application, you sit down in your environment, you start coding and documenting, and then you create an executable and off you go. It doesn't work that way in SharePoint. Deploying an application as a WSP, the governance and the rigor around that code being upgradable, manageable, ported to the next level is almost up to the individual developer. And if that person leaves, you can't just crack it open and see what they did, right? Because it's dispersed throughout your SharePoint farm. So the use of third-party tools, right, whether they're Bamboo, whether they're Nintex, whether they're whatever, is going to protect you and that code for future, right? And it's going to allow you to deliver things a lot faster. So we're calling this a reusable layer of functionality between SharePoint and your custom code, and we're calling that layer a framework solution, okay? So every organization that is creating solutions on SharePoint, you know, you've gone past just your team sites and document repositories, must think of this framework as a critical part of the software stack. And what we're seeing is that you can deliver a higher level of functionality at a much lower cost if you start plugging these components in to your application like you'll see. What this has done for Bamboo is it's transitioned us from a web parts vendor to a solution provider. And that was really our customers dragging us along that path. We're out there selling web parts. We've got 8,000 customers, 70 components, and all of a sudden, a very large customer would call us and say, you know, this critical app is based on these 8 components that we've put together to do this application. And our application is down. We need a more accountable support. We need a better licensing model. We need you to be responsive to us. We don't want to be just one of your 8,000 customers. So we started noticing the shift, especially with 2010, that we're involved with some very critical stuff. And we've developed a whole major accounts program around that with priority support, account management, better licensing, to support customers that are using our tools in this way. So think of Bamboo components or any third-party component as like a modular home, right? These are components that can form the foundation of a prefab structure. We've got pre-configured workflows, templates, different data models. We've got best practices that wrap around how these things work together, how you can aggregate data, consume data in certain ways. And then, of course, we've got Bamboo Nation, which is the largest community of SharePoint users outside of Microsoft, sharing ideas and concepts with what they're doing with our products. And the actual framework components are as follows. Oh, I see this was a little bit of an animation. Hello. Hold on. Oh, restart program. Nice. Hold on, I'm restarting PowerPoint. It should just take a moment. All right. Try that again. Okay. So components, we're talking about products that are commercially tested products, which means when you buy like a Nintex or a Bamboo or something like that, those configurations and the data that you create with them will move from 2010 to 2013 or 2007 to 2010, right? So we're responsible for making sure that whatever you're doing with our products will move to the next level, right? The components are also reusable, which I guess is obvious to some, but if you are using, let's say, our workflow Conductor product or our dashboarding product on a certain site collection for HR, you can reuse that same configuration and component for a site collection delivering a solution to a different group, right? So they're not licensed by the user, they're licensed across the farm and reused for many different applications. And of course, I just went through the major accounts program for the licensing. So we've got 3 different types of applications that we'll see today. We've got what are our standard web parts, right, which are Calendar Plus, Chart Plus, List Rollups. These are single functional items that are installed as through Central Admin and can be used within your site collections to create your applications. We've got solution accelerators, which are a series of web parts put together with a site template, sort of jumpstart what you're going to develop. And a good example is our knowledge-based solution accelerator, which is a full knowledge-based solution that you then tweak to fit your needs. And then we've got full-blown applications. We've got 4 of those, or 3 of those. We've got project management, a community management, and a workflow conductor, process automation. So those 3 components comprise all of our 70 products. So, the concept of, hold on, this is what I want to do, a framework example. So what do we mean by a framework solution? So let's take case management. The concept of case management can be applied to lots of different things, but if you are talking with a stakeholder that says we want to do something on SharePoint, it's probably going to be some sort of case management solution. That is, there's some instantiating event that drives a process, right? It could be a phone call, it could be a web form, it could be an email, it could be a piece of paper, right? It could be somebody asking a question. And that creates a case, right? So you have to log that in a list, right? Assign it a unique ID. And based on the data within that case, we need to go do things. We need to go maybe internally and grab some vendor information or some other information about products that are being asked about and aggregate that together somewhere. We may need to alert different people that this thing has happened, such as a case manager, right, or a knowledge worker, that they need to review something and present that data to them. We need to start tracking time, right? How long has this taken? When should we start raising the flags? This is taking too long, or if it's a certain type of thing, it may have to be accelerated to a higher level. And then ultimately, that person does the work and needs to respond and close the case, right? And that could be an email that goes back to the requester. It could be updating data in a vendor database. It could be just storing things with a retention cycle into a document management, updating a knowledge base, improving your self-service. right? So that's a case management life cycle. When you're thinking of developing something like that on SharePoint, where do you start? You gather after you've gathered your requirements, right? And you're ready to sit down and begin writing an application. Well, you use a lot of out-of-box configurations, but if you had access to a series of components like this, you could rapidly create and prototype that application for your users. And what you're looking for is an agile process where you gather those requirements, you create a site with functionality that the user can test, and then iterate off of that. So you don't black box develop and the ta-da moment, here it is. This way, when you're doing your development, they can say, oh yeah, I meant to do that, but we want to do it a little bit differently, or I'm not really understanding this layout. So in these components, Workflow Conductor is the engine to drive your notifications, your emails, grabbing data, alerts to go out through Alerts Plus on dates that are coming up. So unlike the regular out-of-the-box alerts, which is on change, updates, and deletes, our Alerts Plus adds things based on time, right? If you're 3 days to a drop deadline, that can trigger an alert to say, hey, you've got a deadline coming up in 2 days, you may want to get on this case or something like that. Alerts Manager is a way to manage all of your alerts together to provide a better user experience. List Rollup is to grab data, either from SQL databases or cross-site collections to aggregate it together in a single spot. So when that caseworker is looking at it, we can see all the vendor information, we can see maybe purchasing history, we can see all sorts of other data that List Rollup was gathering together. We've got our Knowledge-Based Solution Accelerator, which may be a repository of solutions that you can prescribe to the case that came in, or a knowledge base to update to find answers or things like that. So what you're doing is you're piecing these things together functionally once you learn what they are to provide a very rich solution through configuring third-party components. Now, there may be applications where you need custom code. Like for example, I was working with a client that had a very unique versioning requirement. They wanted versions of documents within their repository to increment regardless of the file type. Right? So you almost had to create a wrapper around the file that was incrementing versions, but it would go from a Word to a PDF, to a signed PDF, to another Word because they had a change, but they wanted to go version 1, 2, 3. So that was a lot of custom code to do that. So that's fine, that's why we're here and we can do code, but the other 90% of the solution was all out of the box components configured together. Okay? So sample case management applications, dispute resolutions, employee onboarding, legal matter, contracts management is another good one, things like that. And when we say reusable, as you use these components to create one application, you'll all of a sudden have a whole template that you can apply to the next application that comes along, which we find we do all the time. And we've seen some pretty good savings from our customers. They're estimating roughly 40 to 50% faster. As a matter of fact, if you look at the K2 booth downstairs, they're like, I think it's 2 days instead of 17 days, or 2 hours instead of 17 hours. So that's a good savings. I like that, but that's the same concept, right? And we've got 110 developers maintaining this stuff to work for you, so you don't have to worry about it and the like. So it does add up when you look at these sort of major tasks that we affect: data management, reporting and dashboards, deployment of your application, and workflow development. So kind of to wrap this piece up, we're faced with several truths about SharePoint, right? It's no longer a nice to have file share. It's becoming a critical part of your application, your enterprise, and how your company runs. Critical applications are being brought onto SharePoint, right? Control for SharePoint is becoming centralized, right, with exposure at the CIO, CTO level. It's not, on a VM that somebody's standing up as a pet project and marketing simply using. It's, as we all know, it's almost a tier 1 application. It is in a lot of organizations, but we're seeing more of that level of pressure. SharePoint and its implementation support is part of your governance guidelines, right? So it's got to adhere to certain things in terms of upgradability, the way it's deployed, the way it can be improved based on user requests. And developers are faced with that make or buy decision, right? They're almost faced with a how do I do it decision, right? So which leads to a make or buy decision. And what we see is that SharePoint is finally becoming a mature enough application to deliver solutions. It's stable enough, it's scalable enough, it can manage data and access data in new ways. The mobility piece is getting so much better, the process automation is so much better, that, you know, coming from the document management world from EMC many years ago, we would go in and install a whole application to solve invoice processing. And it would have its own UI, its own database, its own language to support it. And then the next room over was a whole different application doing customer support. And then which had its own database, its own UI, its own vendor, its own little local VAR coming in, tinkering. What SharePoint is doing is leveling the playing field. It's saying, for all those frontline business processes and solutions, put it on this platform. Take advantage of the work you've already done and deliver. And we're saying this is how you should do it. So we're going to now take a look at some examples, internet willing. And
has just gone down, but I have preloaded a number of pages, so I'm going to be able to.
Are you need this, right?
Yeah.
Oopsie, let me move this out of the way.
All right. So what Rob was just talking about with case management, I have a scenario that's similar and something that's quite common in organizations where we want users to be able to provide some type of input into changes that they want to make. And so something like a raise your hand question and answer, and that's not the screen that you want to see. And it's not what I have on my laptop. So give me a second and I'll change the display. For some reason you're looking at screen 2 that I don't have. All right.
1980s resolution.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it?
Whoa.
Let's try that one more time because that's not manageable at all. All right. So the scenario here is that we have something called a raise your hand, which is simply a SharePoint list, but we want some processes to be initiated if somebody does give us any type of information. This can be as simple as what they want to see in the cafeteria. I mean, a number of possibilities are available. And just coincidentally, on this page, we also have an enhanced calendaring product in the form of Calendar Plus. And we also have Poll Administrator that you're already familiar with, and a charting component. So we're able to make these home pages for our team sites just a lot more intuitive and provide useful information. But if we just take a look at this form, very simple, standard SharePoint, but what we have going on behind the scenes is this list is associated with a workflow, and because we run this in an initiator mode, it means that my users don't need to have elevated credentials, because in this case, the workflow is going to be triggered because an item has been created, but we're going to actually use the credentials of the workflow creator in order to run that process. And you can see here our workflow conductor. It's a very intuitive tool. It's really just a matter of going through the widget options that are available, and there are about 70 that can do anything from copying items into a list. We can work with Active Directory. We can create sites for site requisitioning. So there are a number of different functionalities that you can build into these workflows in a fairly sophisticated fashion, but you don't need to have a lot of that background experience. And of course, because we're not using SharePoint Designer, you know, a lot of organizations, that's something that they've disabled already at the web application level. So this is going to be a much safer way of initiating these workflows within your organization. And the other very nice element about the workflows that you generate here is that they can be then shared. So I can save this as a shared workflow so somebody can take advantage of the work that I've already done, because maybe the workflow I have here meets 90% of the requirements that they're going to have for their workflow, and then they can just modify, tweak slightly, but they're getting to edit rather than build. And the whole idea is with our products that being able to edit, it's going to speed up the process. You're configuring rather than starting from scratch. So you go ahead, the workflow, it's going to go ahead, it creates an item in another list. Well, that list I can see presented here in another component we have called Data Viewer. And this is an incredibly flexible component. It's going to consume product content from obviously individual SharePoint lists, but also from a list rollup, which, as Rob indicated, can aggregate content from not only a single site collection, but across multiple site collections, and depending on the permissions you have implemented, web applications. And so then you're able to see all of that content in one location. Filtering, grouping, sorting, all of this can be dynamic. With the latest version of Data Viewer, users from an individual on an individual basis can determine what columns they see and don't see in the display. So they can really tailor it. Conditional formatting, as you would expect to see in Excel, the ability to edit as, again, the same type of format you would see in Excel. So it becomes very intuitive because we're building on experiences that users are already familiar with. There's really not a lot of relearning that then becomes involved. Now we happen to, the idea here is that somebody submitted an idea. Well, maybe internally we want to discuss what the response is going to be to this idea. So if you select that you want this to be entered into a discussion board, there's another workflow that will then create this in a discussion board. And of course, this uses our discussion product, which allows us to identify items as being sticky, so that it's always going to remain at the top of the discussion board. That's what happens when I forget that I don't have access to the VPN because it went down, so let me close. Then we can also mark something as being a verified answer. So again, everything just becomes much more visually intuitive, and I think that's a main requirement. We know that when we're looking at list content, it can become very tedious for users, so we have to add that visual element so that their eyes are gravitating to something, we're getting their attention in one way or another. So when you have the workflow conductor, you can see here in the ribbon there are these two buttons that have been added. One is going to show you what the associated workflow or workflows are with this particular list, and then you also get from this create or edit workflows, it's taking you into that designer module that we saw earlier. We have a search product, and of course, you know, search is so important within SharePoint, but what this is going to do, it's going to streamline the search because it allows you to search simply on a single list. So again, the scenario here is we've been collecting all of this input from users about the changes and recommendations that they're making. We've presenting dashboards based on activity, whether the item is open or closed, but we also want to maybe be able to search based on different elements. And so this list search simple is configured to simply reference a single list using and or joiners, and so it becomes then a much more intuitive and faster search. You'll also notice that we have some rather attractive tabs at the top of the page. This is another solution that we have called Sharepoint Navigators. Comes in a number of different forms. We've got tabs, we have drop-down menus, tree menus, but then it becomes very easy to build intuitive navigation on all of your sites. And again, this comes back to the idea that you can take these products and build solutions that are truly relevant for your organization, and you can do it very, very quickly. So we started off with this idea of somebody asking a question. Maybe we've had a discussion about it, and then internally we've determined that it would be useful to have a KB article that's going to provide some information related to that topic. So we do, as Rob mentioned, we have a knowledge-based product. This is something that's going to provide this Explorer type setting for the users, but they're going to also be able to have information that is being captured against this. We can turn all of these articles into a PDF, we can email them, we can collect tracking information, ratings, and so on. So all of these different elements can piece together in a number of different ways to provide the flavor of solution that you require to meet your needs. And as you can see, I've only got one more tab that I opened up, but we've had a number of people ask us today at the booth about our user management package. And so I was going to show you a couple of different screens, and with this would be the latter, but we have these components called password expiration and password reset. And as you can see, we use it internally, so I get a notification email that comes to me to let me know that my password is going to expire, and you can see it's actually going to expire in 7 days. I can then click on a link within that email, come in, and I can now reset my password for my entire network, and I'm able to do this from SharePoint. And password change is another tool that is going to allow people to reset their AD passwords, but they're doing it from a site that they would have anonymous access to be able to make that notification change.